So we're back again, still looking at the market for gasoline and the effects of a tax on gasoline, but now we're going to look at it from the point of view of producer and consumer surplus. Consumer surplus benefit, and producer surplus benefit. And remember that you might want to rewatch the consumer surplus, producer surplus screencast, but remember that consumer surplus is the benefit to consumers over and above what they would have been willing to pay. So in other words, equilibrium price is, I've changed the lettering here. Equilibrium price in this market is at point A. Consumers would have been willing to pay all these prices for all these quantities. That's what the demand curve means by definition. That's all the prices they would have been willing to pay. Oops, I erased my demand curve. But they only had to pay price A because the market and market equilibrium was at price A. So they only had to pay this. But so these consumers here at this quantity of gas, they paid price A and they received a benefit up here. These consumers paid price A and they received a benefit up here. All these consumers all along here, they would have been willing to pay this price as indicated by the demand curve, but they only had to pay price A because the market did not insist on a higher price. And if you think about that, that makes sense. You never go into a store and offer to pay more on the products that you're buying, right? You pay the price that's asked. If you value the product more than you paid for it, then that's good for you. That's consumer surplus. Producer surplus is just the flip side of that analysis, right? These indicate all the prices. This supply curve indicates all the prices at all the various quantities, but all the prices and quantity combinations that the supplier would have been willing to sell. In other words, at this point, they would have been willing to sell for whatever that price and whatever that quantity is. They would have only, if the prices go up, they'll sell more, the profit motive, right? So these are all the prices they would have been willing to take for all these quantities, but they were able to get price A. In other words, all of this area here is producer surplus. They would have taken that price, but the market allowed them to get that price. So that's what we call producer surplus benefit. In this scenario, consumer surplus before the tax is JBA. All the area under the triangle drawn out by JBA is consumer surplus before the tax. All the area in the triangle ABC is producer surplus before the tax. So if we write that down, we'd say consumer surplus benefit before the tax is equal to JBA. And if we look at the producer surplus benefit before the tax, producer surplus benefit before the tax, we'd say that that was equal to ABC. If you add JBA and ABC, we realize that that's society's benefit because producers and consumers are both part of society. Point B is what we call allocatively efficient. Remember that term from the last unit, allocative efficiency. There's no point in this market that's better than point B, according to the preferences of consumers and suppliers. Now, because the government has imposed this tax, and it had reasons, that's the political process, right, to impose a tax, we now see that we have a new equilibrium at point I. Right? We are only selling quantity E, and people are paying price H. But the thing is, though, that producers don't get price H, they only get price F. They're only really receiving a benefit of price F because they have to pay this tax. The tax is equal to the distance between G and I, or between F and H is the price. All of this is the increase in price due to the tax, right? F to H or G to I, it's the same distance. That's equal to the tax. Producers don't get that. Producers don't get that tax revenue. That doesn't go into their pocket. So that's not any revenue to them. That's no benefit to them. That's government revenue. What is producer surplus now in this new scenario? Well, before it was A, B, C. Now it's F, G, C. Producer surplus has fallen to F, G, C. So I'm going to actually say after tax F, G, C. And up here, what has happened to consumer surplus? Well, remember before the tax it was J, B, A. But now, because consumers are only able to buy a smaller quantity, quantity E, at a higher price, price H, now we see consumer surplus is JIH. So after tax, it is JIH. I can go ahead and draw that in a little bit too to help. Right, this is after the tax, the orange, and then purple for producer surplus. What's the government revenue? Government revenue is equal to HIGF, that block, HIGF. That's government revenue, that red area here. HIGF is the government revenue. So what has the tax done? The tax has forced the market to allocate resources differently than the market would have done without the tax. The tax has been successful in reducing the amount of gas consumed and in raising revenue. HIGF is revenue raised. It has been successful in reducing driving and raising revenue for, say, maybe building a road or something. That's usually what gas taxes are used for. It has done so at the cost of reducing consumer surplus and producer surplus. JIH is now consumer surplus and FGC is producer surplus instead of JBA and ABC. That's the trade-off that we have to live with when we make economic decisions. There's always a trade-off. Now you might be wondering, now what happens to these triangles? So in other words, HIBA is that's the chunk of consumer surplus that's lost. Consumers lose that. ABGF, that's the chunk of producer surplus that's lost because of the tax. Producers lose that. But all of that loss doesn't just disappear. A big chunk of it goes into the government revenue. So it's not gone, it's just been reallocated. It's being used for a different purpose, maybe a purpose that you politically are not in favor of, but it didn't go away. Okay, it's in government revenue. But we do find that we do have these two triangles here are lost to society. Nobody gets this. The government doesn't get that value, the consumers don't get that value, the producers don't get that value. This value is, this triangle, IBG, is equal to something we call a dead weight loss to society. What we mean by that is that if the market were allowed to allocate gas at point B, we'd have a net benefit to society of the sum of consumer and producer surplus, JBA and ABC. But because the market is not allowed to get there, the market is only allowed to be here because of the tax, we do have a reallocation of resources. We have less gas at a higher price, smaller consumer surplus, smaller producer surplus. We take from consumers and producers to give to the government, who then goes and builds a road with it. But this black inked in area, IBG, that is value we could have had in society if we had been at point B. But the tax doesn't allow us to go to point B. Nobody gets it. It evaporates. This is what we call unrealized potential or a deadweight loss. Nobody is able to achieve that. No producer, no consumer, the government. It's value that the market for gas is not able to realize because of the tax. Now, we can have a political argument as to whether or not the tax is appropriate, right? We might say that, yes, we're willing to give up this amount of value of gas in the form of lost producer surplus and lost consumer surplus, because we don't want to burn this much gas in our cars because we're afraid of climate change. We only want that much. And that's a perfectly valid point. It's also perfectly okay to not agree with that. And that's what the political process is for. If you don't agree with that, you don't vote for those kinds of things. You'd vote against a gas tax, or you'd vote against the representatives who raised your gas taxes. But this is sound economic thinking, even if you don't agree with it politically. So this is looking at the effects of a tax. This is looking at the effects of a tax on producer and consumer surplus. It's not that much different than the previous screencast. We're just looking at it from the point of view of allocative efficiency, or what we were calling earlier, social welfare. If the use of this revenue, if this revenue is used to produce things of greater value than the dead weight loss, then it's a good idea. Well, if it's used to produce things of greater value than the revenue plus the dead weight loss itself, but it's a good idea.